the overarching confluence known as the video game industry, one series stood above the rest in shaping what is now known as the modern action hack-and-slash genre. Games like God of War, Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, Dante's Inferno, and even Bayonetta owe their very existence to the innovations produced by this now sequestered franchise. Allowing you to play as a character who is as fearless as he was powerful, these games put you in the role of one of the most iconic and memorable characters in all of gaming, and dared you to attempt to fill his shoes. One of the sons of Sparta, the legendary Dark Knight Dante stands at the top of the list as my all-time favorite character. Arrogant, funny, powerful, and cocky, Dante faced down demons the size of skyscrapers with a smile on his face, a one-liner in his head, and a sword in hand. Ironically, it was almost impossible to feel any sense of danger when playing as this character, even though this franchise is known for putting players to the test with its difficult yet rewarding and innovative gameplay. After 10 years of demon killing in this industry, Capcom decided to release the Devil May Cry HD collection in celebration of DMC's legacy and to spark interest in Ninja Theory's specious approach to the franchise. But enough about that banal attempt at socio-political pontification through a puerilely shallow paradigm with a premise postulated through dialogue that would make first graders facepalm in embarrassment, and more about the celebration of a classic franchise that's incised its mark on all action titles created since its release. Devil May Cry HD Collection features 3 of the 4 games in the series: Devil May Cry, Devil May Cry 2, and Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition. Each game has received an HD upgrade that definitely breathes new life into the already beautiful art and character design. This is a series that is all about looking stylish, and it's nice to see that Capcom put more effort into translating these games into HD than they did with their previous HD outings like Resident Evil 4. While the games do look good in gameplay, many of the actual cutscenes haven't been translated into HD, and of course all of the menus are still in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which can be somewhat jarring at first, especially in the original Devil May Cry, which requires far more inventory management than its sequels. The HD collection also features the soundtracks and concept art for each of these titles, which can be accessed at any time from the main menu. The artwork is definitely a huge bonus, especially the concepts for the original game, which consist of enemies, weapons, and character designs that never made it into the final product. While DMC HD Collection itself features some nice, albeit sparse extras, it's the games themselves that are the main draw of this compilation. So let's start by taking a look at the seminal title that started it all, the original Devil May Cry. Initially slated to be the next entry in the Resident Evil franchise, Devil May Cry's premise grew far too grand for the confines of the Resident Evil universe and ended up becoming a brand new IP for Capcom. Set in a world of gods and demons, Devil May Cry follows the story of a half-demon devil hunter named Dante, who has taken it upon himself to stop the resurrection of the demon lord Mundus. While the story itself would benefit greatly from being fleshed out further, Dante as a character somehow shines throughout the entirety of the somewhat basic premise and continues to impress us with every cutscene that he's featured in, besides one exception that I don't want to go into. Once the game finally gives you control of Dante, you'll notice that you don't have many attacks to choose from, but of course, as has become a mainstay in action titles such as this, Dante will grow as the game progresses. Over the course of the campaign, you'll accrue orbs from completing missions, finding hidden areas, and defeating enemies and bosses. These orbs can be used to purchase new attacks and to buy items like the blue orbs, which can extend your life bar, vitality stars which refill your health, and holy water which can damage all enemies on screen. As you go through the menus, you'll notice that the developers took great care in the creation of this game. Even something as innocuous as choosing your weapon seems to exude a style that is unmatched even by later entries in the series. Devil May Cry also exhibits a chilling atmosphere that is reminiscent to that of a survival horror game. As you traverse the sprawling castle of Malay Island, you'll notice violent screams in the distance, children playing, and chilling laughter in the halls. The castle itself seems to have a life of its own and definitely doesn't like the fact that Dante has come in search of its secrets. While the atmosphere and overall design for this game is amazingly well executed, it is the gameplay that will keep players on the edge of their seats. Every action that Dante is able to perform has a specific purpose. Even something as ostensibly trivial as taunting has a direct benefit to the player if executed properly. As you battle through waves of enemies, you'll notice that in the top right corner you're being rated. The more stylish you are, the higher your rating goes, and with a higher rating comes more orbs to spend, which means more upgrades and items can be purchased. While it may seem like getting your style ranking up is just a matter of button mashing, the very existence of this style meter is to prevent that very gameplay style. If you just mash the attack button without putting any thought into which attacks you're using, you will be poorly rated and obviously won't be getting the most out of the experience. A mechanic that also quells the urge to button mash is the inclusion of the Devil Trigger. Since Dante happens to be half demon, he can transform into his demon form at will, as long as he has enough energy in his DT meter. When Dante switches to his demon form, his attacks become far more powerful and he gains access to abilities that he doesn't have in his human form, like flying and using elements as projectiles. Even though Dante is more than capable of making enemies his playthings, these foes won't go down without a fight and feature quite a variety of attacks. The original Devil May Cry to this day still features the most varied and imaginative enemies in the entire series. Enemies like the shape-shifting shadows, duplicating plasmas, and toxic nobodies are all extremely well designed with their own repertoires of attacks and fatalities. The bosses also benefit from this creativity and are the definite highlights of the game. Facing off against the likes of Griffin, Nightmare, and Nilo Angelo all require different strategies and are made to keep you on your toes. What's really interesting is that you'll never really know when a boss is going to show up, and there are even some occasions where you can actually circumvent a few of these battles in subsequent playthroughs. Now, even though I love this game, that won't prevent me from reviewing it objectively, so let's take a moment and talk about some of Devil May Cry's flaws. While the combat system itself was amazing for back when it was released, it is quite basic in comparison to the later titles in the series. This isn't to say that the system itself isn't competent, but it is to say that when compared directly to something like Devil May Cry 3, it definitely shows its age. It can feel somewhat stiff and slow at times, but every move feels a tad more methodical than in later entries in the series, which may very well be a positive to some. Another small flaw is the platforming sections. The jump mechanics of Devil May Cry just don't work well with platforming and may be frustrating to those who haven't already played through the game multiple times. The camera can be another glaring issue, especially during certain platforming sequences and some boss battles like the second and third encounters with Griffin. A slight change implemented in the HD collection version of Devil May Cry is the fact that Dante's actions have been mapped to different buttons. While I did get over this change, it can be somewhat jarring for those of us who had become accustomed to the way the controls were mapped in the original release. In all honesty, they should have added an option that lets players customize the controls, as is the case in Devil May Cry 3 and 4. Besides these minor issues, Devil May Cry is still a masterfully crafted experience that continues to exude creativity all these years later. You'd be hard-pressed to name a single game that was released in this console generation that was developed with the amount of care, thought, and imagination that was put into this single title. With plenty of secrets, awesome music, innovative gameplay, epic boss battles, and the introduction of a gaming icon, Devil May Cry single-handedly defined an entire genre and gets a well-deserved 9 out of 10 from me. Anyone who loves the action hack-and-slash genre owes it to themselves to play this game. It may feel somewhat dated in some respects, but its legacy is undeniable, and its challenge will keep you entertained for hours after initial completion. After the commercial and critical success of Devil May Cry, naturally Capcom planned a sequel. This sequel was to be bigger and better in all aspects, introducing a new playable character, new acrobatic moves, a new camera system, bigger bosses, smoother animations, and a longer campaign. Devil May Cry 2 was set to surpass the original in every way possible. Sadly, all this talk was little more than hyperbole, and the title that we were supplied with was a giant step back for the series. Everything that Devil May Cry built, Devil May Cry 2 dismantled. In the original game, Dante was fast, agile, and had a lot of personality. In the sequel, Dante is sluggish, floaty, and barely speaks a word.
Don't speak. Just die.
There's an overwhelming lack of variety in all aspects of the game, one primary example of this being Dante's weapon set. Dante only uses one melee weapon throughout the entirety of the game. Sure, he can pick up different swords, but none of them handle any differently from one another, and their varying properties are essentially negligible. In the original game, Dante essentially had 2 melee weapons. While this number doesn't seem like much, the weapons themselves varied greatly and had specific uses for any given situation. In Devil May Cry 2, Dante has a sword that's about as useful as a butter knife, featuring little more than 3 ground combos and a single air combo. Overall, Dante's moveset in Devil May Cry 2 is downright laughable. The overwhelming lack of abilities really makes the gameplay feel stale and formulaic, forcing you to rely on your guns far more than your devil arms. In most boss battles, it's more appropriate to just stand back and shoot at the bosses than it is to melee attack them like in the original game. Due to these factors, the gameplay in Devil May Cry 2 feels like a cheap imitation of the original's fresh approach to game design, leaving most players feeling disappointed and somewhat perplexed. While the campaign is longer than that of the original games, it's obviously lengthened artificially through Lucia's story mode, which is almost exactly like Dante's, sans a few trivial changes. Something that exacerbates the repetition is how similarly the two characters play, and overall how dull the game looks aesthetically. DMC2's environments are bland, the enemies are uninspired, and the bosses can look downright silly. The only saving grace to this game's visuals are how well animated the two main characters are, and how awesome Dante's character design is. Devil May Cry 2's Dante features a fan-favorite design that is sleek and stylish. It's just a shame that this incarnation of Dante appeared in the worst game in the series. While this sequel is inferior to its brethren on all accounts, it did introduce some gameplay mechanics that would be perfected in future entries of the series. Introduced in Devil May Cry 2 were Dante's abilities to run on walls, flip, shoot in two different directions at once, shoot in the air while upside down, and melee attack in the air. These abilities would later be used as templates for what would become Dante's various styles in Devil May Cry 3. Another mainstay of the series introduced in this installment is the Bloody Palace, which is a survival mode featuring over 9,000 levels of enemies for Dante and Lucia to overcome. While the original game had on-the-fly melee weapon switching, this title featured on-the-fly gun switching, which was far more intuitive than the mechanic used in the original game. Even though the Dante of Devil May Cry 2 is severely lacking in almost all the charm and personality that he once had, there are moments where you'll notice a glimmer of Dante's true personality.
I was going to be the king of this world!
King? Yeah. Here's your crown.
The game also has an incredibly well put together soundtrack, and even though the story is forgettable, there are some really awesome cutscenes to be found here. Overall, Devil May Cry 2 lacks the heart and soul that made the original game such a classic. If this game weren't part of a franchise that introduced so much to the genre, it would have been a passable hack and slash, but as part of a series that defined what an action game could be, it fails on almost all accounts. While the game itself can be fun in short bursts, it is wholly unsatisfying and disappointing, and because of this, I will be awarding Devil May Cry 2 a 6 out of 10. As a successor to the amazingly well put together Devil May Cry, it failed abysmally and it almost killed the franchise in my eyes. After the mixed reception that Devil May Cry 2 received, thankfully Capcom decided to go back to Dante's roots for the third installment of the series. Promulgating a return to form, many fans anticipated this title with cautious optimism, but after the initial trailer was released, most fans were sold and looked forward to experiencing one of the Son of Sparta's earliest adventures. Devil May Cry 3 follows the story of a more youthful Dante who seems to care little about the world around him. Over the course of the story, Dante faces off against his twin brother Virgil, who is on a quest to inherit the power of their father, the legendary Dark Knight Sparta. As the twin sons antagonize one another over the course of the story, Dante begins to slowly shed the layers of his callous attitude to become more selfless and pure as a person and as a hero. While Devil May Cry 3's story isn't the greatest ever told, it is fun and doesn't take itself too seriously. The cutscenes are amazingly well choreographed, the dialogue can be hilarious at times, and the characters themselves are very likable, namely the Sons of Sparta. Dante's personality also returns to form as he spouts off one-liners just to get a rise out of the enemies that he's facing.
Easy, Fido. How about I take you out for a walk? Come on, puppy. Let's go.
This personality trait also translates into the gameplay with Dante's many taunts. Whereas in the original game, Dante's taunt was just a gesture, in DMC3, Dante actively abuses enemies verbally, and depending on how high the style meter is, Dante will say and do one of several things when prompted to taunt. It really goes a long way with putting you in the role of Dante, who has nothing but confidence in himself and his abilities. It's a small touch, but in my opinion it really goes a long way. Devil May Cry 3 not only corrects the mistakes made in the previous entry, it also builds upon the precedent set by the original game. If Devil May Cry defined the genre, Devil May Cry 3 perfected it. With a gameplay system that is yet to be surpassed to this day, even by its direct successor, the amount of depth and nuance present within the combat mechanics of this title rival even that of a deep fighting game like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Dante can seamlessly switch from one weapon to another mid-combo, creating endless possibilities for creative players who love to come up with novel ways to dispatch of enemies. The game is all about freedom and will give you as much as you put into it. If you want to play this title just spamming the same combo ad nauseum, the game will give you little satisfaction and rate you accordingly. Creativity and experimentation are the names of the game. The developers made sure to give players the tools to fight like a son of Sparta. It's just a matter of whether or not you're up for the challenge. One of the many innovations introduced to Devil May Cry 3 is the style system. Dante has a variety of fighting styles available to him that can completely change his moveset. For example, Swordmaster is an offensive style that focuses on Dante's melee weapons. While Swordmaster is equipped, Dante gains access to powerful melee attacks that can level waves of enemies with relative ease. Each of the 4 main styles that Dante begins the game with can be leveled up 3 times, and with every level comes a new set of attacks for players to experiment with. Each person who plays the game will have their own favorite styles and weapon sets, and every style is balanced just enough so as to not overpower a player's impetus to experiment. While I won't delve into the more advanced techniques that Devil May Cry 3 has to offer, such as buffering, switch cancelling, jump cancelling, and invincibility frames, I will say that there is an insane amount of gameplay depth to be found here, and to this day it has yet to be matched. While singing this installment's praises satisfies me to no end, this is a review, so for a brief moment I shall become querulous and point out some of this game's shortcomings. As I've already delineated, the gameplay in Devil May Cry 3 is unmatched as far as the action hack-and-slash genre goes, but it's in no way a perfect game. One of my main issues with this title is the overabundance of Reaper-like enemies. While all of these enemies do have their own attack patterns, each enemy only has about 2 attacks at their disposal. This is in direct contrast to the original Devil May Cry's enemies, which had pretty sizable movesets including fatalities. The problem overall is that the enemies themselves lack creativity when compared to the original game, and some of these enemies are just a chore to fight against, especially the Enigmas and the Fallen. Some of the missions in Devil May Cry 3 can also be very irritating to play on higher difficulties, especially when going for double S ranks, which require some pretty strict conditions that must be met. Other problems that have yet to be remedied in this installment are the bad platforming and the bipolar camera. For the most part, the camera is an improvement over the last 2 games, but it can be really intrusive during certain gauntlets and boss battles. While the addition of the Devil Trigger burst adds another layer of depth to the already deep gameplay, using the Devil Trigger itself doesn't feel as powerful as it should. Your attacks are augmented somewhat while in your Devil form, but not enough to warrant using it for anything besides a DT burst. Putting these minor issues aside, Devil May Cry 3 is the standard by which all action titles are measured. With an incredibly well thought out move list, novel devil arms, a second playable character with his own moveset, really fun bosses, a well told story through awesome choreography and cheesy dialogue, lots of unlockables, and the deepest gameplay to ever grace the genre, Devil May Cry 3 perfected what its progenitor defined, and because of this I will be awarding Devil May Cry 3 a 9.5 out of 10. While there are definitely some flaws to be found here, the amount of content that was stuffed into this single game is astounding, and puts many mainstream releases in this day and age to shame. Of all the games on the HD collection, DMC3 will most likely be most gamers' favorite, and rightfully so. Needless to say, the Devil May Cry HD collection is a must-have for fans of incredible action games. While the HD collection itself has a few flaws, namely the 4x3 menus, sparse extras, and inclusion of Devil May Cry 2, it was a pleasure for me to experience these titles again in HD. Since this may very well be the last time in a long time that I'll be able to play as a true son of Sparta, I'll continue to cherish these titles as not only a huge part of gaming history, but as a huge part of my life specifically. Devil May Cry is a series that I held to a high standard because it held us as gamers to that very same standard. It challenged us at every turn, but it also gave us every tool that we needed for the job. It never held our hands, but it made sure to nudge us in the right direction. It destroyed our expectations and sparked our creativity, and I can say without hesitation that these are the greatest action games ever made, and some of my favorite games of all time. Featuring what is by far my favorite character ever to exist, the legendary Dark Knight Dante was funny, cocky, callous, confident, and overall fun to watch. Whether he was on screen taunting a boss, playing a guitar, destroying demigods, being impaled, or just having a slice of pizza, I couldn't help but have a smile on my face throughout his many adventures, and I look forward to the day when the true legendary Dark Knight, the legendary son of Sparta, Dante, returns from his long hiatus.